Hi, good afternoon. I was waiting for that. Actually, I've been excited all day long for this event, which is a very exciting and important event. And I was calm all day long until I got in the room and I noticed that former bosses are here, former senior colleagues, former and current champions of women, peace, and security for decades. And so I got a jolt of nervousness about this truly is a great event today. So good afternoon. Welcome to the United States Institute of Peace. My name is David Yong. I'm the new Vice President here at USIP for Applied Conflict Transformation. The Applied Conflict Transformation Center develops and tests innovative approaches to peace building. The USIP itself was founded in 1984 as a bipartisan act of Congress, founded by the likes of Senator Spark Matsunaga of Hawaii, Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon. Both served with great valor in World War II, and both came out of that experience and the experience of their public service, knowing in their hearts and in their minds that they wanted to create an academy for peace, an institute for peace in the United States that would be co-equal to those that served our soldiers so well. So they did so in 1984, and President Reagan embraced their United States Institute of Peace Act. Since that time, USIP has served local peace builders on the ground all around the world. We provide tools and training to local peace builders to give them the knowledge they need to prevent their conflicts, and when their conflicts become violent, to resolve them. So today, we're assembling to discuss inclusive peace processes, mobilizing men as partners for women, peace, and security. We're happy to co-host today with the initiative Our Secure Partner and Ambassador Don Steinberg, who leads that important initiative. For those of you following on the webcast, welcome to all of you. You can follow us on social media at USIP and also hashtag inclusive peace. So please add your tweets to our program today. So why inclusion in peace process? For at least a decade or two now, the international community has coalesced around the concept that peace is based on inclusion. Whether it's the 2011 New Deal for greater engagement in fragile states, whether it was the 2012 UN Secretary General report on peacekeeping and peace building, the 2015 UN review of peacebuilding architecture, or the more recent UN World Bank publication on pathways to peace. All of these documents, important documents at their core, have the idea that peace is based on a legitimate social contract between state and society. And such a contract, we believe, can only be born out of an inclusive peace process. It's not just on principle we believe that, it's also based on empirical evidence. A leading scholar, Desiree Nielsen, has analyzed 83 peace agreements, and she concluded that when civil society is included in an inclusive way in peace agreements and peace processes, the risk of peace breaking down is reduced by a full 64%. Therefore, peace processes provide an opportunity to create this new social contract between state and society, to put societies on a foundation of legitimate politics. So, as we go forward, truly, Resolution 1325, that historic resolution on women, peace, and security, really began the conversation about inclusive peace processes more generally. We now approach its 20th anniversary of how women can be agents of change in peace processes. So particularly with the bipartisan creation of the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017 in the United States, USIP has since bolstered its work in women, peace, and security. Just to give you some examples, we're working on a range of WPS projects, including in Kenya, to advance women's roles in countering violent extremism. In Colombia, we're working to support women mediators. and in Afghanistan to promote women's participation in electoral processes. Also, at the Institute, we make sure to include gender perspectives all across our programming. It's not just a secondary issue or an add-on for us, but it's a core central issue to inclusive peace. I'd like to salute my colleagues Kathleen Keenest and Ro Tucci for leading our work in women, peace, and security. Also, our gender team has produced a new tool called Gender Inclusive Framework and Theory, codenamed GIFT, and it's truly a gift to our community working on women, peace, and security. It's broken down, as you see, you can download it on the web, this framework into three concepts. The first being women, peace, and security generally. The second, an intersecting identities approach. And third and finally, the peaceful masculinities approach. The last, of course, is directly relevant to our discussion today. So I'd like to introduce our keynote speakers today. We're very honored to be hosting them. First up to the podium will be the Honorable Ed Royce, who recently retired as chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He was instrumental in the passage of the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017. He's been a champion for many decades on human rights and women's empowerment globally. And we salute him for his service and congratulate him for all that he achieved in our field. Next up will be Ambassador Milan Verveer. She equally has been truly in the vanguard of the women, peace, and security movement globally. Currently, she is the executive director of Georgetown University's Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Before that, she served in the Obama administration as the first U.S. ambassador for global women's issues. And of course, she was the champion in the early 2000s of the Vital Voices Global Partnership and served in many capacities when that was a government project and afterwards as a project in civil society. So thank you to all. Thank you for being champions of women, peace, and security. And I invite to the podium Chairman Royce.
David, thank you very much. It's good to be with you. First, before we unleash men on this project, there are certain precautionary steps that we really must take. Men can carry legislation on women's issues, but don't have them write it. That would be my first point. There are 5,000 years of recorded history where men are making decisions without the input of women as co-equal partners. And something keeps being left out of the documents, like the right to vote, inherit property from mom, things like that. It's like trusting men alone with a channel changer. For the rest of the family, it will not necessarily be time well spent. In my experience, the best strategies for empowering women are those plans designed by women. By way of example, 6 years ago, as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I had a sense of where I wanted to go to drive this project, but a hazy sense of directions. So at some point, it made sense to me to get women out of the back seat and put them behind the wheel and buckle up. And I wanted to thank my team here. I wanted to thank Amy Porter, my former chief of staff, if you'd like to stand for a minute, and Marie Spear. Thank you, Marie. And Jessica Kelch and Nilmani Rubin for passage of the Women, Peace, and Security Act, the Protecting Girls' Access to Education Act, the Girls Count Act, and the Women Entrepreneurial Economic Empowerment Act, or the WE Act, along with a series of women-focused initiatives aimed at Africa. These bills included women in the process of conflict resolution and in the process of peacekeeping, and helped leverage them onto the police forces abroad so that rapes would be reported and would be prosecuted. They included scholarships for women and girls in patriarchal societies, and and they directed governments to register girls at birth for equal standing in court and equal standing in terms of admission to schools. They included bills to tackle human trafficking, forced child marriage, and female genital mutilation. It was women who drove the process, who developed the hearings, women who testified, women who wrote the legislation. The outcome of the hearings and the legislation to turn the focus of foreign policy toward the protection of the most vulnerable, women and girls, was then supported by men. The second point is that it was kept bipartisan. There was no time or patience to allow it to become a wedge issue. And when a senator tried in either party to put a hold on a bill, Jessica would go down and hunt Ivanka Trump or Nita Lowey out and ask them to talk and reason to the senator. And they did so in no uncertain terms, and it worked. Lastly, they appealed to the typical congressman to look at the problem from the standpoint of the world his own daughter would be facing, which had a way of getting his rapt attention. On this sorry planet, 1 in 3 women will experience violence in her lifetime. We have greatly lessened the mayhem in societies which have struggled to confront female discrimination and exclusion, but those are the numbers worldwide, and they leave us stunned. So the perspective needs to come from the experience of women, in this case, women testifying before the committee, and women like Maria Alexandra Arriaga, Senior Advisor to Futures Without Violence. I appreciate Alex's contribution to Linking Security of Women and Security of States, a book which I recommend to all of you. I'm sure Alex has some copies that she could send you. And she has spent her life thinking and acting on global human rights issues. Her work toward futures without violence has depended on her engagement with champions of human rights across the political spectrum, not just on the left or on the center or on the right. Across the spectrum with a bipartisanship that gets results. Like Alex, keep it nonpartisan. And like Alex, pound away at the facts. We need to work hard to maintain that. And because I feel compelled to integrate this list, let me mention Tom Sheehy and Ambassador Don Steinberg. Don is always most quotable when you've got him at full throttle. Here's Don. Compare those societies that respect women and those that don't. If you think about societies that empower women and protect women in vulnerable situations, those societies are far less likely to be trafficking in people or drugs or weapons. They don't tend to send off huge amounts of refugees across borders or oceans. They don't transmit pandemics. They don't harbor terrorists or pirates, and frankly, they don't require American troops on the ground. Don't tell me that there is no relationship between national security and empowerment of women. There's a one-to-one correspondence. So Don is sort of our Themistocles, the statesman who saved Greek civilization with his persuasive advice, but I very much appreciate his continuance in driving that message. Ambassador Don Steinberg took tremendous risks in Angola 20 years ago to try to end that bloody civil war, and so did Tom Sheehy, who's with us, in Angola and in Congo and in Liberia, where he helped to bring justice. Tom Sheehy, who has lived and worked in Africa and used to be the staff director for the committee, is now helping the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I appreciated their intellectual backing for the Women in Peace and Security Act. So how else do you get to men? Because that's the topic I was asked to comment on here. Most men have a rough sense of justice in them. Tell them that you would end the impunity of warlords like President Charles Taylor, who used boys as child soldiers and girls as chattel, and ask men to help end that kind of impunity. Tell them how women in civil society in Liberia were critical in keeping the peace process on track after Taylor was hauled before the International Criminal Court in The Hague to face justice for organizing tens of thousands of rapes and killings and amputations. Explain to men that the warlord was then replaced by the election of a woman president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who kept the peace and served as a role model to women. Tell them that if concerned men can make that kind of change happen in Liberia, men can help women quell anarchy and mayhem anywhere. Explain to men that dollars spent on prevention are more efficient than millions spent on response. And take one to see Charlie Wilson's war on this subject. Explain to men that for neo-Nazis to jihadists, there is a common thread among most of those who have committed terror. They either as children have been exposed to domestic violence or inflicted domestic violence on others as young men, or they've done both. Apparently, it leads to depression, and to put it mildly, deficiencies in empathy, and then in some, to contemplating making a bomb in your mother's kitchen. And so explain to men that the underlying discrimination against women and the impunity for violence against women, with all of the hell that comes out of it, requires that we recruit men and boys to change social norms on this planet. Alex is right about that. Ladies, ask them to enlist in your effort. Just don't promote them to a rank higher than yours. Thank you all very much.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you, David, for the introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you for this important discussion, because so many of you have done so much to advance this agenda. Thank you, Chairman Royce, not only for your words today, but for your leadership on the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017. You, in many ways, exemplify this topic that we're addressing. But I also want to thank you for your great skill in taking that talent pool of women who worked in Congress with you and unleashing them so they can help advance progress for women as they did, but they did it in tangent with your leadership. So that was a very important contribution, needless to say. And the law today, that in many ways is an example to the world, if we can implement it well, is an important tool to advance the common cause that brings us together. And we will surely need to engage more good men to ensure its full implementation. I, too, want to thank Ambassador Don Steinberg, who is devoting himself to mobilizing men as partners for women, peace, and security. How many of us have quoted his experience in the Angolan peace process? I know I have countless times, because it's such a powerful example for why we need inclusive peace processes, why we need women's agency for sustainable peace, and what happens when that lesson is not learned. It was a life-changing experience for Don, and he has been an evangelist for women's participation in peace building ever since. And for all of us, he's been an extraordinary role model of male leadership on this issue. I am personally grateful to him because when I was serving as ambassador on global women's issues, he was the deputy administrator at USAID. He was a key leader in drafting the United States National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, and he was a critical partner in supporting United States leadership on these issues. He often joked that I said nice things about him because he gave me a lot of money. But the reality was that we were able to achieve a great deal to support women's peace-building activities through the agency of USAID and what Don was able to make happen. If we want to prevent conflicts and build lasting peace wherever war, violence, and instability are a threat, we must empower women as full and equal partners. And as the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and those subsequent resolutions show us the strong linkages between the agency of women and peace and security in all of its aspects. We can sadly agree, as we are gathered here, that progress is nowhere near what it should be. Almost 20 years since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325. And as the Secretary General of the UN has acknowledged, the participation of women in peace processes remains limited. It's a dismal record. Conflicts continue to have a devastating impact on women and girls, and their marginalization is both a cause and effect of conflict. The numbers of women in peace operations is stagnant. Clearly, there is a gap between the established frameworks and the reality. Progress, I fear, will continue to be inadequate unless men play a greater leadership role as partners in this process. And this is part of our call to action today. During my time at the State Department, I found my colleagues to be generally supportive. To be sure, it was clear that this was a priority at the highest levels. That makes a difference. A policy commitment from the top, that's the role Don played at USAID, is essential and impactful. We had to demonstrate that women's participation in peace building was not just a women's issue, but one that mattered, as it greatly does for all of society. It mattered for peace and security, and it has to be released from the silos of that category, women's issues. Moreover, it had to be integrated into all aspects of our diplomatic efforts in conflict-affected states. That meant our work in Afghanistan, in the DRC, in Sudan, in Colombia, in Myanmar. It wasn't that narrow category of women, peace, and security. It was including this in everything we were doing in the ways that made sense in our overall diplomatic work. Too many places to name where a gender lens still needs to be applied for greater effectiveness, and yet it is still too often absent, and certainly not understood to be relevant. I remember so well a desk officer in one of the countries, conflict-affected countries, seriously affected, and I had just gotten hauled in, I should say, by the Congress saying, why aren't we doing more about X, Y, and Z? And when I asked the team to come together, the first thing the desk officer said to me, what the heck does this have to do with women? And that's part of what we're still struggling with, to understand how this is so critical to achieving the goals we all want to see achieved. We need to better understand how our diplomatic efforts are reinforced by development efforts and related to our military actions. That synergy is essential. I felt, too, that we needed to provide examples of good practices. Oftentimes, our embassies would say, we want to be engaged, but tell us how to do this. And those specific examples of how they can make a greater difference were very important, and they're executing their missions. Because there is often a view that this is a nice thing to do, but really not necessary, not strategic, it continues to be important to document that evidence-based case that makes actions of women in peace and security so compelling. But data also requires the political will to act on the data. and political leadership, as we all know, is still largely male-dominated, hence why we have all come together. We need to recognize, and this is something I came to see very strongly, that self-interest is one of the strongest motivating forces, and how to demonstrate that in order to get greater engagement for decision makers, they have to see the connection between women, peace, and security and their own effectiveness in achieving their policy goals. Engaging male leadership makes a difference. And we have examples of many men, we've mentioned several already in this room, who have been engaged, but we need far more at all levels of society and across all sectors to achieve a truly inclusive peace process everywhere, that it matters. It matters when senior diplomats like Ambassador Princeton Lyman, whose last post was U.S. Special Envoy in Sudan and South Sudan, when he recognized and acted on the need for women's participation. So many times he would say to me, we need to do more with the women. He knew that without women's voices, without women organizing for peace, the prospect for true peace would remain elusive. And it's too bad Princeton didn't live long enough to see the leadership role that the Sudanese women have played in bringing down the longtime dictator, Omar al-Bashir. Princeton clearly contributed to that outcome. It matters when military leaders like retired General Allen remind us that no society has ever successfully transitioned from being conflict-ridden to a truly developing society unless women are part of the mainstream. Their leadership in demonstrating the operational effectiveness of women's participation does matter. It matters when Dr. Dennis Mukwege champions women who've endured unspeakable sexual violence in the DRC and is vigorously leading global efforts for reparations. It matters when the UN General Secretary General, commits to naming more women mediators and underscores the necessity of their inclusion. It matters when the former UK Foreign Minister William Hague led an initiative to prevent sexual violence and conflict, and even put this issue on the G7 agenda when people, his peers, questioned why he was doing that. A government commitment that continues to this day. And it mattered when President Trudeau launched a major initiative to increase women's meaningful participation in peace operations. And when UN envoy on Afghanistan and later Syria lobbied his ministerial colleagues at a donor conference on Afghanistan to have them put the needs of Afghan women at the top of their commitments. And it mattered when the Colombian peace process chief negotiator, Humberto de la Calle, supported women's full participation in the peace process to try to bring an end to a 50-year struggle. You get the picture. This does matter, and we have to find every way possible to enhance these efforts, to mobilize men as partners. It could not be more important. How much longer will the world exclude women who are every day taking risks for peace and making peace on the front line? Inclusive peace processes can no longer be an option. They are a necessity. Women and men working together for peace and security. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Don Steinberg, and I am so grateful to Chairman Ed Royce and Ambassador Verveer for their inspiring comments to open up our program here today. I'd also like to thank the U.S. Institute of Peace, Our Secure Future, Strategy for Humanity, and many other groups who have brought us here today, in part to launch in D.C. the Mobilizing Men as Partners for Women, Peace, and Security initiative. You know, here in Washington, we talk a lot about crises. But I believe that there are few that are more menacing or urgent than the crisis we face in our international global security system. When 70 million people around the world are left homeless by seemingly intractable violence, when countries on every continent, Syria, South Sudan, Yemen, Myanmar, Ukraine, Venezuela, and more, are aflame in conflict with no end in sight, when women in Afghanistan legitimately fear that the progress they've made over the last 20 years will be sacrificed on the altar of a false peace with the Taliban, then yes, there is a crisis. And it requires nothing less than a wholesale reordering of our male-dominated global security network. Mobilizing Men as Partners for Women, Peace, and Security brings together more than 100 organizations and individuals who know from our personal experience that the leadership, empowerment, and participation of women and other civil society groups is essential to preventing and resolving deadly conflict, to building stable, prosperous, and just societies, and addressing our most important international challenges. We are men and women from the defense, diplomacy, development, and civil society communities. We are generals, we are ambassadors, we are government ministers, NGO leaders, UN officials, who have pledged to use our connections with other global policymakers to communicate these messages. But equally important, we pledge to open doors, in particular for grassroots women from conflict-affected countries who are fully capable of speaking for themselves with unique authority and credibility. We ally with, we listen to, and we learn from each other under the watchwords, nothing about us without us. A quick origin story, if I might. Our roots go back a few years to a WPS program that Milan organized at Georgetown. She'd lined up a panel that included herself, which would have been good enough, but she also had Secretary Clinton, she had Undersecretary of Defense Michelle Flournoy, she had Ambassador Samantha Power, and some old guy from USAID, don't remember his name. There was a huge audience there, about 1,000 people, and as we left the stage, Secretary Clinton turned to me and said, "Don, where were all the men?" I looked back, and out of the 1,000 people, there were probably 80 men. And so we discussed the sad truth that while men continue to dominate the global security network, they're missing in action, or actually missing in inaction, on the WPS agenda. And we decided to do something about it. We got early support from the innovative foundation, Our Secure Future. We brought in allies from the International Civil Society Action Network that Sanam runs. We brought in Promundo, Inclusive Security, and I'm so delighted to see Swanee Hunt in the audience, who has been such a leader in this area and will speak to us at the reception following this activity. We also brought in the Carter Center, UN Women, Interaction, the Georgetown WPS Center, the Women's Refugee Commission, and others. And we came together in New York about a year ago, and we hoped to launch the initiative at that point. But as we talked, it was clear that we hadn't resolved some basic issues. And I want to say that over the course of the last year, we have had full consultations with more than 100 groups to address these questions. Is our goal simply a utilitarian desire to have better peace processes and more durable and lasting peace? Or are we equally committed to a rights-based approach, seeking to change gender dynamics between men and women in the economy, the political system, the social system, and the security structures? How do we make sure that men don't seek to dominate or supplant women's leadership? And yes, we've been known to do that. But instead learn how to be allies and partners and supportive backbenchers. Can we use this initiative to strengthen grassroots organizations, ensuring them equal access to the corridors of power? And finally, should we focus as well on other groups marginalized by other identity factors, whether that's disability or displacement or sexual orientation and gender identity, recognizing the power of intersectionality? So we went back to the drawing board, and after a year, we released our charter and guiding principles this March with the United Nations at the International Peace Institute in New York City. Again, our goals over the course of the next 2 years are very simple. First, use our connections and access to leaders of global institutions, governments, and beyond to press broadly for engendering peace processes. Second, engage with leaders of a few specific processes, and we're in the process of identifying exactly which ones those are, but we're likely going to be engaged in Afghanistan, Colombia, South Sudan, Cameroon, and Yemen, to ensure they draw on women and other marginalized groups as leaders, as planners, as implementers, and as beneficiaries of their programs. Third, serve as a watchdog to ensure that the UN Security Council resolutions, 1325 national action plans, UN and other regional peace missions, and national laws like the one that Chairman Royce was so important in getting passed, the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017, are fully implemented. And finally, we will stand shoulder to shoulder with activists on the front lines of conflict, helping strengthen their institutions and enhancing their personal security, because we all know that the most dangerous profession in the world is a woman peace builder. We hope that you'll join us. At the end of this program today, our Secure Future Director, Sahana Dharmapuri, will say a few words about how you can engage with us. For now, I'd like to finish with just one last thought. There have been impressive changes in international norms and practices since the Beijing conference a quarter century ago that Milan was so important in driving forward. But we can't measure our success by how many Security Council resolutions we pass, by how many national action plans exist, or even how many women are part of peace processes. Instead, let's measure our results by whether peace processes bring a just and lasting end to conflict, by whether women and other marginalized groups can fully develop and contribute their talents to the well-being of their societies, and by whether violence ceases to be the default setting for disputes in war zones, in communities, and in domestic settings alike. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Don, for outlining the contours of the initiative. I'm particularly very excited about this initiative because I do deeply believe that for the inclusive agenda to advance, we really need a broad base of support. So we owe it to ourselves to continuously think through the various contributions that different identities, different groups can bring can bring to bear. So our panelists today will help us dig a little bit deeper into the role that male allies can play in support of the women, peace, and security agenda. I'm pleased to be joined here by three panelists. I'm not going to go deep into their bios. You have those sheets outside, but they will help us shed light on the value add of this initiative. Just to introduce you briefly, Sanam Anderlini, you are leading women's partner organizations. We're painstakingly working on these issues day in and day out. We also are joined by Dean Peacock, who has spent considerable time exploring the role of men in gender dynamics and power relations. And we are also welcomed by Ambassador McGann, who we welcome your insights into the questions and experiences of policymakers, most recently in the military environment. So Sanam, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit more about your recent efforts working with women, particularly at the grassroots level, to make peace processes more inclusive. What main charge do you give to them? And then as a follow-up, what are your thoughts in relation to the initiative today on how men can be of assistance to ICANN partners? What are some do's and don'ts that you would offer them?
Thank you. Thank you, John. Don, it's great to be here. Thank you. I'm going to put my on.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you today. Thank you very much for inviting me. I want to take it back a little bit. I started in this field in 1996, and my first job was meant to be as a speechwriter. I ended up being a ghostwriter for a book from my boss, who of course was a man, of course. But it was interesting because as I went through that process of writing about conflicts and contemporary civil wars and so forth, it was very frustrating to have literally my voice and my words stolen by somebody else. But one of the things I realized, I was young enough to be able to say, you know, I get to research and I get to learn from this process myself. So it was, at the end of it, I came out thinking, it's fine, my name is in tiny font and in terms of, but I got a lot out of it as well. In terms of male allies, when we were mobilizing to get Resolution 1325, Ambassador Chowdhury from Bangladesh was really the first person who listened and engaged with us. And over the years that I've done this work, I have to tell you that I've had more success and genuine sort of in-depth understanding from our male colleagues in the rest of the world than actually in Western countries. So I just want to, it's an interesting thought. And I think it's because if you're from Nepal or Afghanistan or elsewhere, you have understood what war does to your societies. And whereas when we're sitting out here, it's very easy to bestow our empowerment on the people out there. So this conversation is very, very important because we do need folks here, and I've been on the standby team at the UN, involved in the Somalia negotiations. I've done visits to cantonments and so forth. So I've seen what it's like to be, on the one hand, trying to advocate at the highest levels, and at the same time working at the grassroots levels. And it's a perception issue that we need to change here, that folks out there in the world, Afghanistan, Yemen, et cetera, especially women peace builders, need empowerment. They don't need empowerment. My colleagues, I have a network that we spearhead in 38 countries of local women-led organizations. On any given day, my colleagues in Pakistan, Nigeria, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, you name it, they're negotiating with the Taliban and Boko Haram and others. They are more courageous and brave than I think most of us in this room. They know what's going on the ground. They have a really strong sense of analysis and the trends. We need to listen to them, right? We don't need to empower them in terms of making them feel confident. They have the confidence. But we actually need to listen to what they're telling us. So that's one thing. What we've done at ICANN is that not only we've provided a space for solidarity for these folks to learn from each other, and also elevating in the global level and bringing them into the policy spaces, but we've actually started a fund. We've now given over $2 million of grants between $3,000 and $80,000. We are the most women peace builders are the most cost-effective, most impactful people in the world. Full stop. We don't need more money. We just need more money in the right hands. And so that's what we've been doing with our fund. And then when it comes to the peace process story, we, over the many, many years that I've been doing this, where it was, used to be why women, then we got to how women, how do we get inclusion and gender. So we've now been producing through our Better Peace Initiative, a series of animations and tools that literally say, this is how you do gendered ceasefires, this is how you do gendered decentralization of governance and so forth, and explain why it matters and what benefit it has. And I'll end with kind of 3 messages, if you want. So number 1, it's not about empowerment, it's actually about enabling and opening the doors of access that people have. That's the first thing. Walk in with us. Don't walk ahead or behind or close the door, but walk in with us. And this is why it's been so important working with Dawn on this. Secondly is recognizing that this agenda, I mean, from the beginning when I started this, I didn't have an issue with recognizing personally my own equality. Right, I'm like, of course I'm equal. I come from a very strong family of women who used to question the equality of men to them. So that's my background. But it's recognizing that we are in this to fight for peace so that neither our girls nor our men and boys have to go and fight and maim and kill or be killed and be maimed and traumatized. This is about peace for all of us. And in every single piece of work that my partners do or the work that we've done at the UN level, Resolution 1820, I tried to put in the term men and boys into the language of the resolution as victims of sexual violence. It was taken out. Right? Nobody stood up for men and boys as victims of sexual violence. It's taken us 10 years to get there finally. So women have always fought for their men and boys, and it's always been about everybody. So this agenda is really about that. And then finally, let's recognize that this is all about power. So often people say, oh, women aren't at the table because it's their culture. If it was culture, Afghanistan would look very different to Colombia. It's about power, right? So put that argument aside. And secondly, and when I was working in Somalia, I said to my UN colleagues, instead of calling these discussions power sharing, where the men get around the table and somebody becomes president, somebody becomes, I don't know, minister of this, why not call it responsibility sharing? Because if you're trying to bring peace to Somalia in the middle of a famine, you want to be Minister of Finance? Okay, finance getting food to people, and finance getting the water sorted out. So shifting our own narratives, and this is really very much what women and as a feminist lens we bring to we change the discourse, we change the way business is done. And it needs, we need the men to walk with us and alongside us, and we really need them to be recognizing that this isn't just about rights and empowerment and equality, it's about changing the paradigm of peace and security. Thank you.
I think that was very helpful. Dean, over to you. You've been engaged extensively on redefining the role of men in combating violence and inequality. Can you tell us more about how you think males can be most supportive of the women, peace, and security agenda? What does that support look like? And do you have any recommendations for us on the approach, and why is that approach important?
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's a tremendous honor. I flew in yesterday from Cape Town, and in the process of moving into a new home and a new job, so it's very, very exciting to be here and to have this be one of the first events that I'm speaking at on behalf of Promundo. I speak here really in 2 capacities, as Senior Advisor for Global Advocacy at Promundo, a new position as I mentioned, and as part of the Global Men Engage Alliance. For those of you who don't know the Men Engage Alliance, it's now active in about 70 countries around the world, with strong country networks in about 40, mostly in the Global South, in Africa, Latin America, Asia. And the work that the Men Engage Alliance does is mostly local grassroots work. It's work like that of the organization I used to be with in South Africa, Sonke Gender Justice, where we have done lots of work to hold government leaders to account. So we have taken politicians to the Equality Court as women and men, demonstrating very clearly that when men say misogynist things, like Julius Malema did in the run-up to the 2009 elections, where he said the woman who had accused Jacob Zuma of rape had in fact enjoyed the night. And it was really about positioning masculinities and male political leadership in a particular way. So we, together with women's rights organizations, took him to the Equality Court, and the Equality Court forced him to issue a public apology on national television, and to pay money to a battered women's shelter. And so the work that Sonke has done, we did it recently in the run-up to the local elections in 2017, and again now in 2019, a group called Black Land First had put out a call for the killing of white people, and they really emphasized the importance of killing white women. And so we worked with a range of women's rights organizations to again hold that political party to account. And so the work of the Men Engage Alliance is a mix of those kinds of initiatives and more kind of grassroots community education and community mobilization work. And it's really important work, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment. But part of what I find so exciting about this meeting and your initiative is the fact that you're able to, and in fact reaching men in positions of power. Mostly the organizations that are doing work with men and boys at the grassroots level struggle to gain the ears of the people sitting in this room, ambassadors, important people who hold really critical positions on the Hill here. And so, I want to just really commend you for the work that you're doing to work with men in positions of power. And I think, we don't want to be naive about that either. We exist in a moment where power is deeply contested. We just saw the elections in Europe, a moment of great polarization. If you don't mind me saying so, a moment of great polarization in your country too. And I think we saw some of that play itself out in the recent passage of Security Council Resolution 2467, where the urgency and the attention to women's rights and to violence against women and girls in conflict settings was on the table. There was a momentum, a drive amongst women's rights advocates to make sure that we had a resolution that ensured that women had their rights met, including their rights to sexual and reproductive health and rights, including access to safe abortion in the wake of sexual violence and conflict. And of course that was challenged. So on the one hand, we have a resolution that was powerful, that, as Sanam mentioned, for the first time recognizes the importance of engaging men, has a strong emphasis on prevention, names the arms industry in ways that are unusual, and actually names the private sector, the extractives industry, for the role that they often play in conflict. And so, really, really important, but contested. There is no mechanism to ensure the monitoring of that, which was a key demand of women's rights activists. And of course, the language on sexual and reproductive health and rights was much softer. It's a victory nonetheless. But what I think is really important as we talk about the ability to engage men in positions of power is that we recognize we exist in a moment of tremendous polarization, and that we hold those men accountable in the same way that small organizations in the global south are attempting to hold political leaders who undermine women's rights accountable. So too must that be part of this initiative. And so I'm really excited to be here and to know that that's part of your agenda. I was asked to speak concretely about some of the things that we have learned about engaging men and boys, and I'm going to turn to that in the short amount of time I have left. So I think, I'm going to speak about four things. The first is to really understand better what is the reality of men and boys and how we work with that to mobilize change. Pramundo has led and worked with the International Center for Research on Women, the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, which has now been done in over 40 countries around the world. And it's given us really important data about men's lived realities, men's experiences, men's relationship to the issue of gender equality. And I want to, and gender. I want to focus just on two issues that I think are coming out really, really clearly. The one is we're seeing inequalities, men's work stress and lack of work being a major driver of conflict around the world. Men joining rebel groups, men joining fundamentalist groups, partly because they are not able to live up to the contemporary standards of manhood. They don't have jobs, they're not able to support their families. So I think part of our agenda is figuring out, well, what do we do structurally around chronic unemployment, structural unemployment? So that's the first thing. The second, and it's data that's coming out more and more clearly all the time, and it's been referenced in a number of the preceding speeches, young men who have been exposed to violence at home, both on their own bodies and have witnessed violence against their mothers far more likely to use violence. We've seen that in the mass shootings here in the US. The profile of many of those men is that they witnessed violence and they used violence against their partners. So we as Promundo are working with a range of international partners to figure out how do we really do something with what we now know. So if we know that young men's exposure to violence is a major driver of men's radicalization, men's use of violence, what concretely are we doing? Where are the international funding streams to address violence against children, children's exposure to violence? And at the moment, frankly, in most countries around the world, even though we know this, there's very little available to help young people deal with the trauma of having been exposed to violence. So first point is, I think, we need to do the research and we need to translate that research into practice. The second piece is, I think the important work of supporting local actors, the sorts of organizations that are part of the Men Engage Alliance, to do the on-the-ground work that builds a community environment, a community culture where men respect women's rights. And there are lots of great evidence-based programs that show we can do that in program time. We can achieve significant shifts in men's attitudes towards women within a year to 2 years if we have the right kind of programs in place. And then I'll conclude by saying I do think a part of our work has to be the work of women and men together holding men accountable. That's using our international human rights instruments. It's making sure that we've got strong criminal justice systems, and it's holding our political leaders accountable. I'll close by reiterating what most of the speakers have said. The work to engage men as partners must be done in a manner that's accountable to women's rights organizations and to women's rights movements, and it must be supportive of women's leadership. And we don't always get that right. And when we get that wrong, I think there's appropriate pushback. And so to really reiterate that clear plea that this work must be accountable to women's rights organizations and movements. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Dean. Great, and let's move to you, Ambassador McGann. Can you give us further insights on how you became on board with this initiative, and what tactics or messages do you use to bring others on board? You've worked in the diplomacy space and now more in the defense environment, the range of policymakers. Tell us a little bit more about your experiences.
Well, thank you for that question. You know, when Don invited me to today's event, I thought about it for a while, and I wanted to focus on what could I say that was just a little bit different. How did I become mobilized? You don't become mobilized at the end of your career. It's actually something that begins in the early stages. My bio pretty much lists a lot of assignments, but I think probably the most defining assignment I had was my service in 1989 at the United States Mission to the United Nations, where I was the action officer and speechwriter for Ambassador Judy McLennan, who was the first ambassadorial rank person to the Commission on the Status of Women. At that time, we were promoting the inclusion of women into senior levels at the United Nations, and by the way, that work still remains to be done. But one thing struck me about that work at that time is that the lack of diversity and inclusivity at our own mission and actually throughout the UN in this issue made me understand fully how Frederick Douglass felt at Seneca Falls. All right? But what really bothered me more so than anything else was that the conventional wisdom at state at that time was that if you pursued such soft multilateral issues, that your path to promotion was limited and that you really needed to deal with hard issues. And that said, and being a contrarian, I decided to follow, and I'm going to quote, another admonition by Frederick Douglass. He said that the life of the nation is secure only while the nation is honest, truthful, and virtuous. To me, that meant that promoting human rights, and we all know that women's rights is human rights, seeking gender equality, and protecting vulnerable populations was a pretty good basis for a national security framework. And as I advanced through my mid-level of my career, and that's something for all of you young people to understand, that, again, mobilization begins as you go through your career. It's a lot easier to get things done when you're an ambassador, right? But it's a lot tougher to convince the public affairs officer that we need to send the first Aboriginal Australian women to the United States on the International Visitors Program. It's a lot tougher to include women's groups when you do election monitoring in Kenya. It's a lot tougher when you're trying to protect, as a mid-level officer, vulnerable refugee populations. All right? It's a lot easier when you're an ambassador. All right? But I did find that as an ambassador, you got to do the one thing that you couldn't do when you were a mid-level officer. You got to say, I believe, all right? And people will listen to you. And by the time I made it to National Defense University, right on the heels of President Obama's executive order on the National Action Plan, which was undergirded by Secretary Gates' follow-on order, I began to convince the U.S. military that we need to look at including elements of women, peace, and security in our operational thinking and planning doctrines. That mission success was critical to understanding how the elements of women, peace, and security can be included in overall strategic planning. And you know what? We got an inviting audience from the United States military, because they began to understand that moving away from the general nomenclature to understanding how to operationalize women, peace, and security led to mission success. That opportunity at National Defense University suddenly launched my senior career in women, peace, and security. And fortunately, I was actually adopted by our Secure Future to be a member of their board. But again, as we go through the next round of questioning, I can give more details, but I really wanted to emphasize that mobilizing males is not something that begins at the end of your career. It starts at the beginning. It's an ongoing process. It means that you have to be sometimes a little bit different. You have to stand up and say, this is not really just a contest over philosophy, but really it's an engagement over the proper uses of resources and implementation of proper programs, and you can make that difference. Right? So, again, Don, thank you for bringing me to this event, but I really want to understand that mobilization is an ongoing process. And for those who in the room who don't know this, Frederick Douglass died in 1895. I know there's some in Washington who don't understand that, but I just thought I'd point that out. But there's ongoing relevancy to the work that we do. All right, thank you. Right.
Thank you. Well, thank you for those concrete recommendations and experiences. If you have any comments on each other's points, let us know. But in the meantime, I do want to move to a question and answer. We've got about 10 minutes for that, so there are microphones going around now. You can also weave your additional comments into the questions. Yep, take one back there. We've got a few up here.
Okay, I guess I'll go first. Hi.
Yep. No, please go ahead. We're going to take 3 at a time, if that's okay.
Okay, my name is Mariana Prado. I'm a recent graduate from Georgetown University studying conflict resolution and focusing on gender. So my question is, from an intersectional perspective, how do you get men to engage also with LGBTQ rights issues in the gender umbrella, especially since in many societies, masculinities are so hetero and cis-normative? Thank you.
Got one up here.
Hi, Karen Ryan from the Carter Center. Thank you for this important event. The question I have has to do with Afghanistan. Right now, women, just as we're meeting today, Afghan women have gathered to talk about how they can get themselves included and assert a fair process, a good, effective process. Can I ask the panelists, what can we do today and this week and next week to get through to the U.S. delegation? That we need U.S. leadership, European leadership, UN leadership to make sure the women who are very well organized right now to get them in, and Yemen as well, Afghanistan and Yemen, we have a real opportunity right now to do that. Could we do something today?
Okay, let's get one more over there. We'll come back.
My name is Pazme Ekbarze from Afghanistan. I have a question which is based on a theoretical perspective from an article by Chakravarti Spivak. She talks about epistemic violence, which means that women are devoid of setting narratives and discourses for themselves, and they have the rare agency to define themselves. If we see in every critical juncture, in post 2001, and even in peace process talks and these reconciliation process, women are sidelined somehow. Even if we look at yesterday's 100th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Afghanistan and Moscow, women were not there. The presence was only a single woman who is highly corrupt. Every single person knows this, Fawzia Kofi, and there was no other person in there. And the second is that we have so many women in Peace Council, but like in the name of Asila Wardak, Habiba Saraj, these women are not being heard. They have a very rare presence. How will this work? The men mobilization in a patriarchal and a conservative society is not a sudden work to be done. It needs a gradual effort to be taken.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's go to the panelists to respond to those three questions. Who would like to start? Sanam, you'd like to?
I'm going to take the Afghanistan question from two sides. From the standpoint from the states, we have the Women, Peace and Security Act. We have many of us, and we, with the Carter Center, ICANN penned a letter saying we need a hearing on the implementation of the WPS Act vis-a-vis the U.S.'s involvement in Afghanistan. This has got nothing to do with the Taliban and what the Afghan government wants or doesn't want. This is about the U.S. having a law and whether we are a country of rule of law and whether we're going to implement and abide by our own laws. And if we don't, the world is watching, right? So this is a real moment to say this is where the rubber hits the road on Afghanistan, on Yemen, and I would add to it on the question of Iran as well, with the drums of war beating, as we all know. So this is, and we, tomorrow, let's have a hearing, tomorrow, next week, whenever. Let's make sure that the U.S. delegation is meeting the Afghan delegation. We have made sure that the Afghan delegation of women have money to be able to travel wherever they need to travel. They have the resource. They are prepared. So it's a question of, is the U.S. going to show up? On the question of, in a patriarchal society, every society has patriarchies and oppressive patriarchy and also openness. I don't think that we should, I think we should, Kentucky and Alabama are very different places to New York and Massachusetts, as we've just seen in this country. One of the things that we've been doing, and again, it's women leading the effort. In Afghanistan, we've supported for the last 3 years with a total grant of about $35,000 in 3 years. One of our colleagues who has been working with men in actually enabling them to talk about their fears and vulnerabilities and experiences of living through war. And it's the program has been designed, she works with imams, she works with district leaders, she works with young people. She's now mobilized over 600 men. They've created a men's network, and they have transformed their own communities and their own, literally the spaces, women's participation in the political process. Let's bring those men to talk to the Taliban. Let's bring them as part of the delegations, because those imams and so forth can bat back, point for point, anything that the Taliban has to say. So there are men there, and I think the issue is we know that men want to be good, And so channeling the good in the guys is really one of the strategies that we see our partners developing, and we've been supporting them do that, because I don't think that we should be thinking that men are all hetero, whatever, toxic masculinity stuff. That's true, but in all of my research, the most toxically masculine, violent men, when you start talking about what they're worried about or what they want for their children, it opens up a whole space of engagement, and I think that there's scope to bring out the humanity as well.
If I can add to that, from 2000 to 2002, I was deputy director of the Office of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. So that sort of made me president at the creation. One of the things that we tried to do in 2002 was to make the situation regarding Afghan women central to our policy in Afghanistan. We were trying to integrate women's issues into our overall policy approach and not make women's issues peripheral. Right? What we have to avoid, I think, for the sake of expediency, is somehow reach an agreement and abandon those same core values that we have. Moving beyond Afghanistan, I know we can do that. For example, when I was in Fiji, one of my principal tasks was to get Fiji off military sanctions because of the coup and return them to peacekeeping operations. However, at the same time, I made it clear to the coup government that the leaders of the opposition to the coup were largely women's groups. And if there were ever any instances in which the violence that was perpetrated upon women at the beginning of the coup occurred again, I assured Fiji's leaders that they would never see another peacekeeping mission. And at the same time, I also nominated 4 Fijian women to receive the State Department's International Women of Courage Award. The point that I'm making is that we cannot abandon the centrality of women's issues and the overall integration of those issues into our policy goals. Once we do that, if we do that rather, we'll find ourselves in a situation that you just described in which we're playing catch-up. We're suddenly behind the curve, and everything that we've worked for up to that point suddenly gets abandoned for expediency. And I think the message that has to be sent in the case of Afghanistan in particular, but to policymakers in general, that women's issues will not be abandoned for the sake of expediency.
Yeah, I appreciate the question as well, Karen, and I was also involved at the creation, including at the Tokyo conference in 2002, and then I went with Milan 10 years later to the Tokyo conference on Afghanistan, where we both marked the success we had achieved, and Secretary Clinton, backed by Milan, got the entire international community to agree that unless there were provisions for women's empowerment in the development plans, we would hold back our assistance. It was one of the first times we've ever done that. And so I personally feel very strong commitment here. And let me assure you, Karen, that we are engaged. Sanam didn't mention that she and others, including I think yourselves, brought a great group of women here to Washington from Afghanistan a few months ago to make exactly those points, especially on the Hill. We had meetings at the U.S. mission to the United Nations and with our ambassador there, where we made these points. We've been communicating quietly, because at times it requires a quiet communication as well. You can name and shame a lot, and I love doing that, but I also love that quiet communication, and I want to stress that last point. In 2008 to 2010, I was the foreign policy advisor for the Elders, that group of Nelson Mandela and Aung San Suu Kyi and Graça Machel and Desmond Tutu. And very frequently, their meetings would be very quiet. They would go and talk to senior leaders, presidents and prime ministers and generals, and say, "You're blowing it here." And the other thing that they would do is they would bring along with them younger, in most cases, women who would make the same points as well. And they would, as Sanam was saying, walk in together, not a question of here's this young woman, you should listen, but here's this person who really knows what's going on the ground, and you should listen. So I would not mind if we did something even more aggressive today, and we can talk about that at the reception, whether there's a statement we should be issuing or whatever from this group as well. Just very briefly, on the question of LGBT and other degrees of marginalization, I have always found that the compounding of marginalizations leads to some very frightening experiences. If you're a displaced person, you have certain vulnerabilities. If you're a displaced person who's a woman, you have other vulnerabilities. An older displaced woman, a lesbian displaced woman who's older, from an indigenous population, it just multiplies. And you can actually see it in the likelihood of being subjected to sexual violence. I've always believed, for some reason, that the easiest, and I know this is going to sound strange, the easiest entry point is through women. Once you establish the notion that you need community participation in the peace process, then you can say, oh, by the way, we don't know what's going on with displaced people. We don't know what's going on with disabled individuals. We don't know what's the impact on LGBT communities. We need them as well. And having demonstrated by having women in the room who know what's going on and can inform the process, it facilitates the possibility of bringing those other groups in.
Thank you. Okay, let's move to one more round. You could weave your comments in if that's okay. It's just in the interest of time. Let's do one more round of questions. I'm going to hold you a little bit longer. So a little bit of this. I know we got our closing too. What?
The overflow room. Are there any questions?
Oh yeah, we could check that as well. Okay, let's go. Oh, you've got the mic. Let's go to you.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for your comments today. I'm Stephanie Klein. I'm a mediator and a facilitator. My question is, your movement for mobilizing men, I'm sure that it can reach a lot of men. You've given some great examples. My question is, what about the men who you can't reach? What about the misogynists out there? I worry that a movement such as this is going to hit roadblocks when it runs up against men who do hold very serious misogynist views, not only at the level of national decision makers, but also the everyday misogyny that women who are working in this profession at the grassroots level or wherever, how do we confront this misogyny? Who is best to confront it, men or women, or do we confront it together, and how?
Let's go here and back there. Let's see if we can get the answer.
Thank you. My name is Fariba Parsa, George Mason University. I am also founder of a nonprofit organization, We Empower University Women to Become Leaders. I have a question to Sanam. I think it's very important you mentioned that women are empowered and they don't need we empower them. So can you explore about, so when you listen to them, so what is the main or biggest challenge and how can we support them? Because that is the issue we want all of us to support. Thank you.
Can we go back there? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Augustine. I'm a graduate student of American University in the program of International Peace and Conflict Resolution, and I'm interning with Tragedy Assistance for Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. I have a question. Anyone can take care of it. With regards to policy, as far as I'm concerned, inclusive peace and gender equality has to start with the grassroots. And I want to ask what has been done with regards to making making sure that precise gender inclusive languages are included in peace in policies concerning peace processes, and making sure that it's well inclusive of both the men and the women, the old and the young, because I believe, particularly with patriarchal societies, these languages, specific languages, can help to drive the understanding of gender equality and inclusivity in peace processes.
Great, thank you. Let's go. Dean, did you want to take a stab at that first one and then over to Sanam?
Yeah. So your very important question, what do we do with the men who are resistant to change, who are misogynist in various different ways? I mean, perhaps two different directions there. We have worked with men who are seen as being very resistant to gender equality in lots of different settings. And I'm thinking particularly of the work that I did at Sonke Gender Justice, working with traditional leaders, religious leaders from very conservative religious communities, and men in communities generally who at first encounter fit the description of what you were describing. And I think my first point, first response would be, I've learned to feel actually quite optimistic about our ability to shift men in grassroots communities. And, in some of the ways that Sanam was describing, to open up a conversation about, what was it like to grow up in a patriarchal family yourself? What was it like to witness violence perpetrated by your father against your mother? What was it like, in community settings? We'll often ask men to identify role models. Lots and lots of men cannot identify male role models. And we can work with them to say, okay, the pain that is so evident in your response to this question is surely not something you want to reproduce within your own family, within your own community. And so I've learned to feel quite optimistic and often see that optimism be, in fact, quite accurate in terms of expectations of change, including when I worked for many years in San Francisco with perpetrators of violence, men who had come in recalcitrant, unapologetic about their violence. Ask them to talk in a little bit more detail about their own childhoods, have them go through a list of the violence that they'd perpetrated. And in the thousands of intake interviews I did at a place called Men Overcoming Violence in San Francisco, I can remember only one or two who said that they felt good about the violence. Most of them answered that they felt ashamed, that they felt horrified by what they had done. Now, I don't want to be Pollyannish and naive about it either. Many of those men went on to perpetrate violence again, right? And so there is also, and this is the second part of the response, an urgent need for accountability, a criminal justice system that, holds men accountable who use violence. And in the wake of the O.J. Simpson case here, the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in '94, things changed. And we've seen levels of domestic violence go down in this country significantly as a result of those changes in law and in the legal environment, the way the courts function. So there does need to be a strong, accountable policy response. So I think it's both of those. Now, last point I'll make, men change when the world around them changes as well. And so when we extend expanded parental leave, when men are involved in the lives of their children early on, they're much less likely to use violence. They're much more likely to stay involved in the lives of their children. And there are a range of important policy shifts that I think can contribute in meaningful ways to men embracing far greater gender equality. As I say, I remain very, very optimistic about the possibility of change. I wouldn't do this work otherwise. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Sanam. I think I'm going to give you the last word, but if there are other burning final statements, okay, we'll get two more burning final statements from Don and Ambassador McGovern. But over to you, Sanam, and
Sure.
Just to keep in mind, we're a little bit behind, so we'll wrap this up.
On the LGBTQ question, when we, 20 years ago, when we saw evangelicals coming into the UN space and pushing back on reproductive health care, and then when we heard women saying there's violence and Salafis are coming in and they're just, they're attacking women and so forth, and we said, this is violent extremism. This is a phenomenon that we were, essentially, the attitude was, that's violence against women, that's culture. Right? But that violence against women is exactly the major security threat that the world faces today. So it's metastasized and become terrorism and all these problems. It's the same with LGBTQ, violence against LGBTQ communities. These are early warning. These are the people who are really at the front lines of seeing what's happening, feeling it, hearing it, seeing it. We have to care and listen to them and their strategy. So I just want to put that on the table. On the question of how do we empower women, or what is it that, empowered women, how do we challenge, how do we support them? The way that we're doing it right now is, number one, affirming to them that they actually exist and their work matters. Being a peace builder, as Dawn said, is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. It is one of the hardest jobs in the world, whether you're at the grassroots, in any of the countries that I mentioned, or frankly here. I get the most horrific threats on Twitter when I say no war with Iran. And I get it from supposed human rights activists, they're all bots and whatever. But it's not pleasant to be told you're going to be hanged, right? That's the kind of threats that peace activists get, physical on. And so we provide a space where it's solidarity and affirmation for their work, but more than anything else, they are invisible. People don't believe that my partners exist. And I'm like, these are like invisible superheroes out in the world that nobody knows exist, because we're so used to saying we want to empower women. Right? So that's why I'm saying we have to change the discourse, and that's why it's so important for them to be brought, for people to meet them, for policymakers and for senators and others to actually see what it means to be an Afghan woman peacemaker and have them at the table. The Yemeni women have all the right solutions. They've been getting detainees out of detention far more than the UN has, right? So it's really changing the visibility factor. And then on the misogyny question, I totally agree with you. I think that when we engage men and provide them with a space, they don't want to say that most of the people I've talked to don't want to admit that they've committed violence. They think it's shameful, right? So we have to shift the paradigm, but we need to give a safe space for them to actually engage in the discourse. And positive male role models are really critical. We don't have many. I asked a Liberian fighter once, who's a role model in your community? He thought and he thought and he thought, and I said, maybe President Obama. He had to come all the way here, right, in his own community, not the priest, not the teacher, not the doctor, nothing. So this is a real issue, and I think that we need to actually go back to the history in terms of what it meant to be men. Men used to have to be able to dance and write and be gentlemanly and as well as sword fight or whatever it was. Now it's become, you can sit and have a beer, and I mean there's a shift in terms of masculinity as well that we need to be thinking about.
Thank you. Yeah, final comments.
I think also we should not forget the importance of legal frameworks. The Women, Peace and Security Act of 2017 gives us the basis of a legal framework for structural changes in institutions that are required to carry out women, peace, and security. We now can also look toward resources, program implementation, personnel policies, and maybe I'll just end where I began. If you make it difficult for men not to get promoted because they did not follow the new guidelines, then perhaps you'll get different behavior. And one final thing, men will be able to see the success of these programs because, as I've always said to Sanana, we don't need to do research. We need to use the resources that we have to create our own data, and that data will prove that the programs are successful and that therefore we can carry out the goals that we're trying to achieve, and men will carry them out. Thank you.
So 3 quick points. On the question that you were just addressing, I have seen so many Promundo programs in the field that are so effective in this area. I've seen one man who confessed that he beats his wife because he was powerless and couldn't get a job, and the only model he had was his father, who when he would get angry would beat his mother. and that was the model. And then he joined one of the Promundo groups, started listening to women and the impact that it had, and he told us in a group that he looked down at his baby son and said, "This pattern stops with me." And he's been on the straight and narrow ever since. I have a very different approach as well, which is based on the Martin Luther King quote, "I can't make that white racist love me, but I can sure stop him from lynching me." And that is, yes, the hearts and minds will come. I believe in the arc of justice in the world, but I also believe that behavior is very important. And if there is behavior that is misogynist, you can get rid of that. You can get rid of it in the ways that, Steve was just saying. We did that at USAID, where we said you cannot be promoted to the position of a mission director unless you have a record of having been an inclusive, equitable, and diverse leader. And we denied a couple of promotions very publicly on that basis, and so you communicate that message. Your question on words and language is very important, and I don't have the time to address it here. I will say that I believe in firm repetition of language because the phrases get in people's minds, and so the phrase "nothing about them without them," my friends at USAID used to make fun of me because it was like I'd go to the bathroom and I'd come back and they'd say, "Oh, Don, did you tell anybody nothing about them without them in the restroom?" But we can maybe talk about that after this program. The last thing I wanted to do was to thank two people who are in the room right now, Kathleen Kunetz and Steve Steiner, both who brought this institution into a new era of focus on these issues. And without them, I don't think we'd be here today, and we certainly in the global community would not be as cognizant of these issues. So thank you, Kathleen and Steve.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me wrap this panel up, and then we'll hand it over to Ambassador Barton. Just a couple of phrases that we heard: opening doors and walking through those doors with them, the importance of understanding men's reality, the role of men in holding each other accountable, recognizing that these are not soft issues, the value of being able to make statements like "I believe," the value of quiet communication. So let me hand it over to Ambassador Barton to give us the concluding remarks. Yeah, please come up, and we can head down. And then to our partner, One Earth Future for the final remarks, and then on to our reception. Ambassador Barton, you served in several roles at UNHCR, USUN, State Department, and USAID. So we look forward to hearing your remarks as you played several roles and worked with several colleagues in mobilizing their action. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. I know one of my jobs is to make this concise. I'll try to see if we can save 15 minutes by reversing time as much as possible. But I do think that there are two jobs here to do. One is to just highlight a couple of the ideas and words that I've heard and sitting here and joining you. I expected to hear inclusive, expansive, and creative. And the need for change is obvious. We're not that successful. It's the hardest work on earth, and there's plenty of room for improvement. And I think those were really well stated. But I also heard the idea of insistence and how insistent we have to be, that it's just no matter what you have done and whatever we've written and the practices and our own good role modeling and whatever, that if we're not insistent, we're not likely to be successful. And I think it's a word that is maybe a little dated, but then I also heard redemptive and principled, and we've got to be counted and seen. And we have to bring our words and these laws into life. And clearly our behaviors matter. So those are all some of the really powerful ideas that I think bear repeating briefly, but we have to live them. The second thing I thought I'd do is this: I'm always concerned with how we take big ideas and policy and practice and our best intentions and turn it into actuality. And that's by far the hardest. And we've got many, many, many great examples. But I just thought, since it really does come down to not just those of us who are powerful in foreign capitals where we come from countries that have all the advantages that the United States has, but it still comes down to the places and the people of these places. And I just thought I'd quickly mention three things that really have come to mean a lot to me in terms of making change possible and encouraging it, being catalytic, and giving partners every chance to succeed. And the first one is to really make sure that we do a much, much better job of getting to know the people of the place first. And just the most basic questions that will clearly bring out the inequalities and the gender issues in a way that we can't possibly appreciate just until we get to a place. So immersing ourselves in those local people and getting to know them is clearly, I don't think you can go anywhere without that. The second one that I would mention today, I'm just going to mention three, is focus on youth, because most of the countries we're working on, 50% plus are under 25, and we still have a chance to shape behaviors, a better chance to shape behaviors than you do teaching older dogs new tricks. So I think that we really want to emphasize that. And finally, I really like the idea of popularizing the ideas and changing the narratives and using the readily available in almost every country communications packages and opportunities that are there. When I was at the State Department, we did a lot of this work with Milan and others, but we were really able to help bring the first independent women's radio station in Syria to life. Now, we didn't come up with the idea. There were obviously women who were doing it, but we made it possible for them to get to the next step. So I just think that if you're going to take on social norms, you have to absolutely change how people are talking and thinking about these things. And clearly, American television has been, for all of its flaws, has been a major contributor to our really rethinking most of the gender equality issues that we have made so much progress on in the last few years. So it's a pleasure to have this this semi-last word, and it's always a pleasure to work with Don. Thank you for what you're doing, Don. Thank you for your vigilance in this matter. Your insistence is welcome, and I hope that we can all step up and be the partners that you want, so that our role modeling will bring these issues to life in this country. We have a long way to go, and I'm not sure we're going in the right direction, but I'm sure that with the energy of this particular room, if you all take it to the barricades, we can probably reverse some of the trends that we're suffering through right now. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'll keep this very short because we have a wonderful reception following the panel event. As you might know, my name is Sahana Dharmapuri. I'm the director of Our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference. We are a program of One Earth Future Foundation based in Colorado. And we're really pleased and delighted to have been able to partner with USIP and others to bring this panel together and have this discussion beginning the launch of Mobilizing Men Partners. I really want to express my appreciation first for Ro Tucci and Rachel and Lexi Van Buskirk from our team at Our Secure Future for making the event possible, from doing the work behind the scenes. And then, of course, our delight and gratitude for all the panelists and all the speakers. We have such a distinguished group of speakers today to share their experiences and begin this conversation. Very much view this as a beginning. I also would like to take the lead from Ambassador McGann and say, I believe that actually the greatest gift of feminism to the world is to ask questions and to challenge what is. And I think that is what we have started to do today. And it's the beginning of the conversation, and there's much more important work to be done, but it couldn't be a more important and crucial time to start doing the work together. And one thing I'd like to underscore is that something all the panelists said is we have to do this in partnership and collaboration, men and women across the aisle. We can't solve this problem alone. It has to be together. So if anyone is interested in this room in getting involved with Mobilizing Men as partners, we do have a lot of information on our website, oursecurefuture.org. There is the charter, which please read it, please sign it, please comment on it. Myself, you can speak to myself or Lexi Van Busker, who's in the back if you raise your hand. We can definitely give you more information about other ways to participate in this. I would like to also mention a poll that we participated in with our partner at WASL, with Sanam's group, and World Pulse, asking women around the world, how do you define security, to again talk about how can we change the conversation, change the narrative of what we think about security and how we can achieve it. So thank you very much for being here today. Thanks to our partners and everyone in the audience for being so engaged, and enjoy the reception, please.
Hello.
Just wanted to say hello.
There's also some mugs from, there's also